For years, the dream of homeownership has seemed increasingly out of reach for many. But what of those who can't even afford to rent? Social housing waiting lists are overflowing and the number of available dwellings just isn't keeping pace. Welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, and today joining me is Nicola McDougall, Chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, PIPA, and she's a passionate advocate for fair and more effective approach to social housing. You see, despite the government's raking in billions of dollars from property taxes each year, our social housing stock has remained stagnant and the number of people in desperate need of housing continues to rise. Now, I'm not talking about affordable housing. We'll explain the difference in just a moment. But unfortunately, private investors are being blamed for this crisis as well. That's not the case. That's not really fair. Nicola will help unpack the reasons behind the housing shortfall, discuss some of the impacts of government policies, and we're going to explore what needs to be done to provide adequate housing for all Australians. So, if you're a property investor or somebody who just cares about the future of housing in Australia, this episode is for you. So, let's get started.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Over the last couple of years, house prices have increased substantially around Australia and rents have skyrocketed. Without a doubt, rising accommodation costs are inflicting financial pain on many Australians. But soaring rents are squeezing people on low incomes particularly hard. The share of rental accommodation that's affordable to low-income households has slumped, and I recently read that less than 1% of currently available rentals in Queensland were affordable to a single person earning a minimum wage or to a pension couple. It's terrible that we're reading that some people are now homeless in Australia and that even 10 cities are appearing across our nation. And the number of people desperately waiting for social housing is skyrocketing. And while the proportion of social housing compared to total housing stock continues to dwindle, this all makes it a very complex situation and people are pointing fingers in all directions. So to help navigate this crisis, I'm joined today by Nicola McDougall, Chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, PIPA. Nicola, welcome back.
Thanks, Michael. It's always good to be here.
Now, we talked about affordable housing and we also talked about, social housing. What is the difference before we get into it so people know what we're talking about?
Well, I think it's important to make that differential there, Michael. Social housing is fundamentally, the responsibility of governments to provide housing to the most vulnerable members of our community. So that has been, a responsibility of governments for decades versus affordable housing, which clearly is an idea around being able to produce properties that are more affordable for people to not only rent but also to purchase.
Sure. So I agree with you that it's the government's responsibility. That's what we pay our taxes for the hospitals and the schools. And I was going to say for the politicians. I'm not sure we really should be paying for them. But anyway, our job is to help the disenfranchised people in Australia. And in general, it's not their fault. So this is not a judge of people. So maybe you could start by giving us an overview of the current state of social housing in Australia and what's actually happened over the time.
PIPA actually conducted some research over recent months about this to really find out what the situation is. And our research showed that there are around about 175,000 households currently on waiting lists for public or community housing across Australia. Now, that's up by about 20,000 households in the past 10 years.
Wow.
More of I know, it's quite extraordinary. More than a third of people seeking urgent assistance from governments are unfortunately being turned away, which was up sharply from 29% 8 years ago. And what the research showed, which wasn't actually that surprising, unfortunately, for those of us in the industry, was the fact that Australia's total social housing stock of dwellings has barely changed in the past 25 years. And so that total social housing stock is around about 430,000 dwellings. And so a lot of people might go, well, that sounds like a lot. But over the last 2 decades, Australia's population has increased by 33%. So it's clear that the supply of social housing has not budged, and with that higher population that we have, we are seeing more and more people needing social housing, and there's not been the supply of social housing available. Also, some data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare that we looked at during our research showed that the proportion of social housing dwellings as a percentage of total housing stock had seen a steady decline over the past decade, and it slumped to just 4.1% of total housing stock in recent years.
Well, I know in Victoria, years ago when I was young, they built all those public housing towers, and over time they've been pulled down, they've disappeared. And while they're replacing them in some areas, that also comes with a loss of older established ones that are clearly past their use-by date. So the government has let these people down, hasn't it?
It really has. And, over the last 25 years, perhaps 30 years, private investors have been doing the heavy lifting in regards to the supply of rental housing in this country. And I think from that period on, state governments decided, private investors are active in the market. They're more active than they have been in the past. We supply negative gearing benefits. Whoop-de-doo-dah, we give them the 50% capital gains tax discount. We don't have to. We can actually, I guess, hand over that responsibility. And I think that's what's been happening. And now they've been caught on the hop. Successive state governments have not only been funding an appropriate number of new social housing dwellings to be constructed, they've also been selling, their social housing product as well over the years, often to improve their own balance sheets.
Well, let's be clear, it's the state government's responsibility to provide this social housing, and it's, in general, private investors like you and me and the listeners of this podcast to run small businesses providing rental accommodation for about a third of Australians who choose not to own at the moment. And it's not always because they're poor, is it, Nicola? It's often just the stage of their life that people need rental accommodation, but that's a very different story.
Well, exactly. I mean, I had a discussion with an ABC journalist recently who was actually relatively open to my point of view, and I was trying to explain to the journalist that, there is always a percentage of them, of our population that are renters. And that's been the same, round about the same for as long as we can remember, as long as the data is there to support it, because we have rites of passage of growing up. When you are young and you finish high school and maybe you go to uni and you start renting, or you move out of home and you're a tradesperson or something like this, vast majority of people go flatting, as we call it, or go move into a share house. You have obviously a huge volume of people who are migrating into this country, myself included, many decades ago, who generally don't go and buy the first property in the first location that they live in when they move to a new country. So there is always a proportion of society that needs rental accommodation. I think the argument gets confused because it's not about people being renters for life. And unfortunately, there will be a proportion of people that are renters. They may not earn enough money to ever purchase a property, to purchase their home. It's not something that is available to absolutely every single person. Generally speaking, it's a fluid rental market. People are coming in, entering the rental market and exiting all the time. And that's been the case since, time immemorial, really.
Sure. Now, just following on from what you said a moment ago about governments pocketing money, selling off their old public housing, social housing stock, in your PIPA research, I see that you found that in the decade leading to 2021, the New South Wales government pocketed $3 billion by liquidating chunks of its social housing stock. Now, I understand they need to upgrade it, but it doesn't sound like they've actually put it back into this same pocket. They've actually used it for other functions in their budget.
Exactly, and I think it's quite difficult to find this data, actually. That might not be that surprising, let's be honest.
You wouldn't want to publicise it too much, would you?
And it's very difficult to find, and the fact that we did manage to find some was a bonus, really. As we started our conversation, like our research also showed that the proportion of social housing compared to total housing stock fell to less than 5% in the 4 biggest states over the past 10 years. So, for example, in New South Wales, that percentage of social housing stock available is just 4.7%. It's only 2.9% in Victoria, 3.5% in Queensland, and 3.5% in Queensland and 3.9% in Western Australia. So the proportion of social housing stock compared to the total housing stock available in each of these big states has been falling drastically for the last 10 years. And I'm sure it has been the case from the time before that. So yes, like you said, Michael, there are properties, certainly those that have been around for decades, that become obsolete and they need to be demolished. However, it's clear that they haven't actually been replacing them.
Well, private investors are often blamed for high housing costs. They're the punching bag for certain political parties, some of a particular colour persuasion, and then they're used as an ATM by other political parties as well. Why are governments using private investors as scapegoats for the housing crisis?
It's a fundamental misunderstanding on the vital role that private investors have played over the last 3 decades in the provision of rental housing around the nation. Look, Michael, you've been doing this for many decades, myself as well, just about two decades now, actually. And I have been involved in, property research and analysis for the best part of that time, but also working within membership associations the entire amount of time as well. I've experienced periods where we had Labor governments, and I've experienced periods where there's been coalition governments, and certainly over the last 5 years, I can't remember a time where there has been more attacks on investors from a state government level. Thankfully, the feds have mainly stayed out of it. Mainly at this point, we do have a federal election next year, so we'll see what happens there. But I don't remember a time where there has been so many anti-investor policies, rental reforms, increased property taxes, new property taxes, changes to land tax, freezing of land tax thresholds, you name it. As we chatted before the chat today, Michael, as someone who works or who represents a national association, there is so much going on that it's impossible for one person like me to actually remember it all, because every other day there is something else that gets announced or proposed. I actually just finished a submission on behalf of PIPA yesterday, which was for the New South Wales government. They are looking into prohibiting no grounds evictions in New South Wales. So, and then we heard the other day as well about the freezing of the land tax threshold in New South Wales. Clearly there are those raft of rental reforms that have happened in Victoria, the reduction in the land tax threshold there, a lot of investors exiting that market. And in Queensland, we recently, just a couple of weeks ago, had a new rental reform, which was the it's the limiting of rental increases attached to the property instead of attached to the tenancy, which they have decided in their wisdom to apply retrospectively. And honestly, like those ones that I've just mentioned, that's only been in the last couple of weeks.
Well, it's an election year, isn't it?
I know.
And so there's the federal government, and we actually, I felt a number of investors felt comfortable that they didn't mention negative gearing, but the state governments are in on this as well. Now, I believe there's going to be more election promises. I think there's going to be 2 big factors in the upcoming election: housing affordability, and the other's nuclear power. I don't think we can get onto the nuclear power one. You and I aren't qualified to talk about that. But if you're talking about housing, it's not really even social housing they're going to talk about. They're going to talk about housing affordability. I recently read that Housing Australia, which is the agency tasked with delivering Anthony Albanese's $10 billion affordable housing fund for low-income families, Housing Australia paid more than $24 million to external consultants and $6 million in annual executive salaries last year. And that's despite not having yet delivered a single completed home under this scheme. And of course, Nicola, it's us as taxpayers who are paying for this. I'm not sure the government knows how to administer these things.
I think that whether it's at federal level or at state level, we have heard a lot of jawboning over the last couple of years. Once the rental crisis was apparent, once it was clearly entrenched, we have heard a lot of politicians at state level and federal level throwing these ridiculous numbers at us that all of us in the industry know are not real, that are never going to happen. The timing of, when these things are supposed to start, unsurprisingly, generally, we actually don't need to actually prove any runs on the board until 2025.
Funny about that.
State elections finish by then, federal election, etc. And it's really frustrating because it's just all hot air, and they haven't put any policies out there that actually have any chance of becoming a reality. And we're supposed to sit here and just listen to a bunch of, promises that, let's be honest, are unlikely to ever become a reality. I get very frustrated with all of that. And I think about some of the forums that I've been invited to, that I've attended in person or via Zoom. There's a lot of talk going on. There is a lot of talk going on. And clearly there's a lot of money being spent on consultants to talk some more, but we haven't actually seen anything being constructed as of yet. I feel that they need to say that they're doing something, but I think their ability to actually do it is not there.
No, it's not. But I bet there's going to be a lot more talk about these with some grand ideas prior to the election coming up. Now, just to put things in perspective, the average Australian property investor isn't a rich mogul. We've discussed it before, Nicola, that currently there's many property investors in Australia, but just around 2 million. But having said that, 72% only own one property, 18% own two properties. There's actually only 19,920, according to the Tax Department, investors, less than 1%, who own 6 or more properties. So they're ordinary Australians taking a financial risk to protect their financial future. And they need the tenants, but the tenants need the landlords also, because in Australia, as opposed to other countries, the government has actually given the responsibility for providing this accommodation to the 2.1 million, there's 3 million tenants around Australia, 1 in 3 people, I take that back, 1 in 3 Australians, so it's actually 7 million people who rent accommodation. I mean, there's families there, of course, so there's not 7 million rental properties, but the government's given that responsibility to people like you and me and our listeners to do, because they're not doing it like other countries where the governments provide accommodation for average investors, not just the social or affordable housing.
Oh, 100%. And I think that now they've got egg on their face because we're now stuck in a situation that you and I have spoken about many times, Michael, before, but that actually started is nearly a decade ago, let's be honest. I mean, we're in 2024, which is a bit worrying. Those APRA changes actually came in end of 2020. Actually, they were end of 2014, I think. That's how long I've been doing this for.
100% right. So APRA's macroprudential controls, throttling banks, they didn't allow them to lend as much to investors as to owner-occupiers because they were concerned about the level of investors. That was 10 years ago. You're right.
Yeah, and you know what? I remember that happening. And at the time, I was the editor of API magazine. But I remember that happening and sitting here in Brisbane, knowing that the market here was pretty woeful at the time. The property market was pretty bad. We had a massive oversupply underway, etc. And yet, as an investor myself, at that point, I had 3 properties in my portfolio as a single lady, but they put these screws down on everyone, all investors around the nation. And when the issue at the time was specifically Sydney.
Sydney, yeah.
When
Look, at that stage, for those who don't remember, it was getting a bit out of hand, where close to 50% of all purchases were to investors in Sydney, many of them off the plan, many foreign investors. But Nicola, that could have led to quite a significant downturn because it was based on speculation. That's very different to the sort of markets we're currently getting, where speculation isn't part of what's happening.
When it happened, I was very annoyed, and perhaps they didn't have the ability to do so 10 years ago. But why wasn't it geographically constrained? It was buying, okay, well, there's this lending limits going to be put in place for these postcodes, right? Because what it did was, yes, it took the heat out of the Sydney market and in regards to investment, and that needed to happen. But it killed the investment market in most other parts of the country. And then you can actually see in the official data from the APS the volume of new loans for investors just starts falling, and then it carried on falling. And it's only recently started to go back to what historical averages have long been. So, you only need to look at that to recognise that the normal volume of investors were not there. And as we've talked about before, and as our PIPA survey shows, and we're actually starting to do the survey again only in a couple of months, geez, it comes around quickly, shows that we've had, an exodus of investors out of the market too. So here we are. Things are grim. Unfortunately, they're going to be grim for quite some time. So instead of governments announcing these pipe dreams of some ridiculous amount of supply that seemingly is going to, materialize out of thin air, what they really should be doing is encouraging and incentivizing the people that provide the majority of rental accommodation in this country. How they do that? Look, there are many ways that they could do that. Geez, it would be nice to have some type of incentive. That probably is unlikely to happen in my lifetime, but you never know.
Well, they're giving it to big corporations, aren't they, to do build to rent? That's coming out of your and my pocket.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And even in the federal budget, there was an announcement there about some incentives for foreign build-to-rent suppliers, but nothing for us investors who supply most of the housing. Maybe it's tinkering with capital gains tax to encourage more medium to long-term investment. A bigger discount if you hold for longer. All of these, there's so many different things that could be considered, which would encourage more investors back into the market. Because at the moment, again, I was talking to a journalist recently, another journalist, and they were trying to argue that there was nothing wrong with investors selling and that wasn't impacting the rental market. And I said, okay, then, well, you tell me then why is the vacancy rate 1%? Why is the vacancy 1%? Where have the properties gone? So if investors are selling and that's a good thing, then surely the vacancy rate should have been increasing, but it's not. It's actually got to 1% or thereabouts around the nation, and it's stuck there. They didn't have an answer, unsurprisingly.
I think they're saying, well, it's going to allow first-home buyers into the market, but somebody's still got to provide the accommodation for tenants who are suffering. Okay, so we mentioned a moment ago that the various state governments have come up with various policies. One I found quite interesting, again, an election year, was recently the New South Wales government announced a $450 million scheme to provide essential workers with subsidised rents in New Sydney. Now, I understand that. That's not social housing. This is now cheaper accommodation for essential workers, because I can understand that in Sydney and in all our capital cities, teachers, nurses, firemen, policemen should be able to live near where they work, and sometimes they can't afford it. So the budget set aside $450 million to build 400 built-to-rent accommodation. They're actually going to build them themselves. Landcorp, the government authority, is going to become a developer, and that's interesting. But when you unpack the figures, that actually breaks down to, if you divide it by the 400, $1,120,000 cost of construction of each of the units. That's the construction cost. And again, the government owns the land. They're talking about doing it on land they already own. And we know the government's not really efficient at building anything. So that's not going to be efficient use of taxpayers' funds. So they say, hey, we're going to use the land that we already own and we're going to build 400, and that's what it comes out to. But the other thing is 400 affordable dwellings is a drop in the ocean compared to the huge population increase that is currently happening in New South Wales, and it's going to continue even if immigration comes down a bit. But the other thing I found interesting, and I'm going to read it out to make sure I get it right, Nicola, is the government said any profits that come about as a result of the project will be reinvested so that we can potentially envisage stage 2 and 3 of this. Now, clearly the government's got no idea what it costs to construct high-rise dwellings, and if they do offer discounted rents to essential workers, and I'm not against the idea, I'm just saying the numbers don't work, where's the profit going to come from? The only profit I can see, if their renting is higher than their holding costs, I can't see that happening. And we also know it's going to take a number of years for these developments to get out of the ground. So it actually sounds interesting.
Terrible.
But boy, when you break down the figures, even if the government fast tracks everything, 400 dwellings, really? And in Victoria, there was the big housing build program aimed to address social housing, but that seems to be deemed a failure as well. I'm not sure that the government are the right people to get involved in commercial property developments.
No, not at all. And I think, certainly with the federal government plan to build supposedly 1.2 million, it's, they are honest about they will be, suggesting that I think it's through the each state
Yeah,
government.
they're not going to build it. They're not saying they're going to build. They're going
No,
to encourage
but
others.
partnering, supporting
Yeah.
the construction of this volume of dwellings, partnering, and then through the state government partnering with private, obviously providers. But at the moment, the construction sector is, not doing well. We have a number of challenges there. And then I guess when, in some locations like Victoria, where the market is pretty benign, developers are hardly going to be racing out to construct new properties, especially when investors have been exiting the market. So the situation in Victoria specifically is likely to get much worse before it gets better. Geez, I don't know how many years you and I have been talking about the rental crisis, but we're probably on to our third year now, and probably back then we said, oh, well, we're at least here for 5 years. And now here we are probably of year 3 of making that statement. But I don't know, Michael, I just don't see any way out of it anytime soon, short of some type of policy that incentivizes more investors to get back into the market, because that's just not happening at the moment.
Well, the opposite's happening because land tax changes are occurring. We know Victoria led that. They pioneered that, unveiling $5 billion in property taxes in their budgets last year. The most striking of this, of course, was the land tax threshold, which decreased from $300,000 to $50,000. So if you own a share of a property and your share's more than $50,000 in Victoria, that's not hard to get. Everyone's paying land tax. And that, as you said, that's seen an exodus of investors. Now, I don't think it's only the land tax that's created the exodus of investors in Victoria. It's been all the other fiddling with the Residential Tenancies Act. Investors just want some certainty. Tell me what the playing field is. I'll make my decisions, and if it stays the same, I'll wear the consequences. But to keep changing the rules, that's not fair to me, Nicola.
No, it's not. And there's, I think I saw something recently, was it something like 133 rental reforms in Victoria? I mean, that's just mind-boggling, isn't it, really? And then you have, the increased financial impost through minimum housing standards as well, which are all relatively new. And that's not to say that investors do not want to, and majority of them do not supply a habitable, safe dwelling. But this is all just more financial outlays that investors are having to finance at a time when their mortgage repayments have often more than doubled. And whilst, yes, rents have been increasing, they've only been increasing, a small proportion to the amount that our mortgage repayments have increased at the same time. So unfortunately, it's become more and more obvious that for some highly leveraged investors, and maybe there were more highly leveraged investors that we didn't know about, they simply cannot afford to continue to be an investor in a high interest rate environment, and they're having to offload those properties. I was reading something about it, I think actually earlier on the Australian Financial Review, about that there is an increase in those number of investors, perhaps who clearly probably haven't worked with experts. You'd certainly hope that they haven't worked with experts. Maybe they jumped on the bandwagon during COVID, or it could have been a few years before that, or whenever it might have been. But during a much lower interest rate environment, they decided to go out and purchase an investment property, or maybe two. But now that rates are so much higher and their mortgage repayments have skyrocketed, they simply can't afford to continue to hold on to those properties.
Well, one of the unintended consequences of all this, of course, Nicola, is that Melbourne's vacancy rates are hovering near 1%, causing long queues for rental properties and rents to skyrocket. Now, I know some investors are looking for options in other states, and that's also shown by the finance figures where, compared to other states, there are fewer new investors in Victoria. Only 30% of buyers are investors, looking at the finance figures. But in my mind, investors should focus on the long term. This is currently, I guess, creating a window of opportunity to get into the markets, because Melbourne's sitting at maybe the stage that Brisbane and Perth were 2 or 3 years ago in its own property cycle. And I think those who take a long-term perspective, there's no doubt that Perth and Brisbane will do better than Melbourne by the end of this year. But if you take a long-term perspective, you're going to get a free kick from the market picking up as well. But Nicola, we say we've been talking about it for a long time. I remember in the early 2000s when I used to do the seminars around Australia, a lady came up to me after a seminar I conducted in Sydney. I can picture her coming up to me and saying she was planning to sell her investment properties because her land tax bill in Sydney was too high. Now, I remember asking her, how much was your land tax bill? At that time, remember that was about 20 years ago, and I don't really remember what it was, but it was something like $10,000 a year. And I asked her, how much have your properties increased in value over the time you've had them? And she told me they'd increased by hundreds of thousands of dollars. And just putting that into perspective, she realised she shouldn't sell her properties. Now, Nicola, I never saw her again. I don't know if she sold her properties, but if she held on to them over the last 20 years in Sydney, they'd probably doubled in value and doubled in value again. So my advice to investors concerned about land tax is just see it as a cost of doing business. Now, there's no doubt it's a wealth tax, and we know that the New South Wales government has now got a stealth land tax by not increasing the land tax thresholds, holding them still so more people are going to pay land tax. But I don't think you should try and guess which state's going to offer the lowest tax, because I think it's a domino effect. Victoria started, New South Wales is now doing it. The other states, when they need some money, are probably going to do the same. So rather than trying to guess which state's got the lowest taxes, just go back to the fundamentals. Only buy investment-grade properties that over the long term will do well. And we've always spoken about the concept of diversifying your portfolio. If you're only in Sydney or only in Melbourne or only in Brisbane, you're not going to get the benefit of having the benefits of good, well-located properties in all the states, Nicola.
100%, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Michael, in regards to Melbourne, just because there's a bit of a herd mentality going on at the moment, often based on some, media scaremongering, and notwithstanding the fact that perhaps some investors are so put off with the new land tax regime in Victoria that they've decided to exit. But let's be honest, Melbourne is is it the largest city or the second largest?
Population? Well,
yes,
it is if you've got the new boundaries which they set last year.
Okay, well, let's call it that number. The biggest, it's the most populous city we have in Australia. It's an economic powerhouse. It welcomes plenty of overseas migrants. We're sitting here saying, well, it doesn't make a good investment location just because for a temporary period of time, you're going to have to pay a little bit more land tax. I mean, now, if you want to actually operate opposite to the herd would be as a great time to get into Melbourne.
Yes, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful.
That's exactly right.
Warren Buffett said.
Warren Buffett. So, I mean, it would be, I think it's a great opportunity because the market is very flat at the moment, and it's about developing your own path, working with experts.
Well, you can outperform the market in property. You can't in the share market. It costs me the same as it costs you to get BHP shares or CSL shares or whatever. But in property, by knowing the right things and understanding what to look for, you can outperform the market. Maybe I'd like to share, just before we finish off, one other hidden New South Wales tax that was hidden in the budget, but the REI NSW, Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, put out a press release recently because they dug into the budgets and found the New South Wales government plans to charge property owners more to offset increasingly unaffordable insurance costs, Nicola. Buried deep in the budget's explanatory notes was that New South Wales government plans to redirect the cost of emergency service levies away from insurance companies, and instead they're going to be incurred by property owners. Just to explain, the resourcing requirements for the state's emergency services, and they're critical, we've got to provide those, they're largely funded by a levy that in the past was put on insurances. So, if there was floods or other things, the insurance company or industry would pay for the emergency services. But with the growing impact of climate changes and more natural disasters, these requirements are increasing, making insurance more unaffordable. And so what the government's decided was, hey, we'll remove the emergency service levy on insurers and instead spread a replacement levy across a broad base of property owners. This wasn't covered well in the media, but it's going to increase surcharges for foreign purchases, increase surcharged land tax, which we've just spoken about, freezing land tax thresholds, amongst other measures proposed. They didn't say what they are. They didn't say what they are. But the money's got to come from somewhere, Nicola, and it's going to come from property owners.
Yeah, that's right. And, there does seem to be a mindset that we are the perpetual cash cows for governments, the plethora of variety of property taxes that property investors pay. the number 2 revenue raiser for governments. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars, which is unfortunately why we're unlikely to see stamp duty got rid of anytime soon. Even if they might turn it into an annual tax, it's just stamp duty, another name. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by that, and the fact that they've hidden it in the detail is not overly surprising either.
Now, this ended up being a little bit of a negative conversation.
Yes.
But you and I have known each other for a long time, and you represent the Property Investment Professionals of Australia as chairperson of PIPA, and we are not negative people. We do understand that the media has got its agenda of coming up with these stories because they create good headlines and we click. We do understand the politicians are against us, but I actually feel very positive for the long-term fundamentals of property. They're going to be underpinned by a strong population growth, Nicola. 1 million people are going to come to Australia in the next 3 years, or our population is going to increase by 1 million people in the next 3 years, and the 3 years after another million, and the 3 years after another million. I mean, we've got a business plan to get to 40 million people by the middle of the century. Australians are going to keep aspiring to own their own homes. The migrants are coming in and they're going to help boost our economy. And they're coming here in part because they want to live a better lifestyle and own their own homes as well. And so the government's going to keep hitting at us. And I think there's going to be pessimists out there all the time telling us not to get involved. But just look at the history of it. I think property is done correctly, still going to be a sound way to develop your own financial freedom, to protect yourself. Because from all we've said, I wouldn't be relying on the government for my financial future.
No, exactly. And I agree with you 100%, Michael. I guess the negativity during our conversation today is just about frustration with policymakers. And, it's difficult not to be annoyed and continually having to get your head around, new policies that impact property investors, when really what we want them to do is leave us alone. Leave us alone to get on with the job of providing the majority of rental accommodation in this country, as we've done for decades. Don't change policies, here and there and everywhere. Let us have equal and equitable access to lending. Let us not have to pay higher interest rates just because we're property investors. Please don't change the goalposts every 5 minutes. Let us, as the people that provide the housing for the majority of renters in this country, let us get on with the job, because you guys haven't done anything about it in the last few decades. All you're doing is stuffing it up. So please leave us in peace. And that would be like the very, very base level of what we're looking for. If you do that, then we property investors will be the solution to the rental crisis, and we will carry on doing what we've been doing for a long time, because as you've said, Michael, from a financial point of view, owning a property investment or two, as the majority of investors do, is going to not only supply housing for our population, but also improve our own financial futures in the decades ahead.
Wow, what a great way to finish our chat today, Nicola. Thank you very much, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.
Thanks for the opportunity, Michael, always.
I hope you didn't find my chat with Nicola McDougall too pessimistic. I think you could hear the frustration we're both experiencing with the government's interference in property. And I know what that's doing is making some people decide to put off a decision of what to do. Before I discuss that just a little bit more, if you enjoyed my chat and you want to get more of this type of information, but you don't currently subscribe or follow this show, just stop on whichever podcast app you're listening to, or if you're watching or listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe so twice a week you get our updates. But as I said, it's actually just making some people decide to wait and see, or even sell up. But if you think about it, every choice you've made has resulted in exactly where you are right now. And it's no different. The choices you're going to make after this quick chat I'm going to have with you are going to create future outcomes for your life. The choice will be either to have a chat about your financial future with one of the wealth strategists at Metropole or not. Look, for the time being, let me call them Road A and Road B. Road A represents a road travelled by many, many successful property investors. In fact, for the last 25 years, that's how long we've been helping clients safely outperform the markets, through strategic property and wealth advice and then our buyer's agency. And this is the road for somebody who wants to take control of their financial destiny, like Nicola and I were discussing. It's for somebody who's looking to get more clarity and direction in today's confusing economic and property markets. It's for somebody who wants to succeed financially and recognises that at Metropole, we're much more than just a buyer's agent. And even though we're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, we're small enough to care. The alternative, of course, is Road B. It represents the path you're on now. This decision will keep you on this path until, of course, another choice presents itself. Now, I've got no idea when that's going to be or what you're going to do, but the choice is yours. Road A, have a chat with my team at Metropole. Lock in a time for a complimentary wealth discovery chat. Just go to metropole.com.au. And I'm not exaggerating when I say over the last decades we've helped thousands of investors build substantial property portfolios. And you've probably heard me say that a recent audit of the results of our clients showed they're 7.3 times more likely than the average investor to own 6 or more properties. In my chat with Nicola, I explained to you that less than 20,000 investors in Australia own 6 or more properties. But I guess our clients made the right decisions because they got the right advice. So why not go to metropole.com.au and lock in a time for a complimentary wealth discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists to discuss your options.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I want to remind you that success requires luck and luck requires work. Now, I must give credit to this chat I'm about to have with you to my good friend Tom Corley, who's the co-author of my book, Rich Habits, Poor Habits. And we were having a chat the other day and he reminded me of something he'd written about. You see, I believe the average person performs far below their abilities. They do what they have to do to survive, to get by. They avoid taking risks that could disrupt their lives. Most people are risk averse, aren't they? On the other hand, I've found, and Tom Corley found in his Rich Habits, Poor Habits study, that true success is the byproduct of unleashing your innate abilities, exposing them to the light of day for everyone to see. But this requires risk. And taking that risk is a leap of faith in yourself and your abilities. And the problem is, most people don't ever do it. On the other hand, unleashing your innate abilities is really nothing more than just pursuing something you enjoy, something that brings you joy while you're engaging in those activities. But here's the problem. Oftentimes, exploiting your own innate abilities requires an enormous investment of your time before the investment begins to pay dividends. And because the investment doesn't produce immediate rewards, for many people, it ends up being a problem. Developing your innate abilities by hours of work, hours of daily practice combined with daily reading to gain insight into the knowledge to perfect your abilities, it just requires too much work for the average person. Now, you've heard me say it before, luck comes when preparation meets opportunity. When you devote yourself to something that you're passionate about, you're engaging in activities that tap into your innate abilities. And by developing those abilities, and that takes time and investment of time, but by developing those and engaging in them over and over again, you're eventually going to become an expert. Developing expertise takes time. Some would say 5, 10, 15 years at a minimum. Often it takes longer. And there's no short-term payback. So this investment in yourself tees you up for success later in life. I found opportunities eventually present themselves. If, however, you're not prepared when an opportunity comes your way, then the opportunity passes you by. But if you are prepared, if you've done the hard work for many years, if you're ready for it, when that opportunity does come along, you're going to be ready to pounce. Now, many people call this fortuitous alignment of preparation and opportunity luck. But those who prepare their entire lives, those who invest in their abilities their entire lives, they become the beneficiaries of luck, of meeting preparation and opportunity. Now, we all have special innate abilities. Mine isn't in sport or in mechanical things, but I found what I'm good at. You've got to find what your inborn strengths are, what's hardwired in your DNA. And it's probably there right from birth. Your job in life is to find out what you're good at and devote yourself to it for the rest of your life. What you're good at is usually something that comes easier for you than to others. That's life's way of winking at you. Your strengths are cues for you to find your inborn natural abilities. Find your strengths, devote your life to improving them, and luck will follow. Luck, of course, is the precursor to success. You can't become successful without luck. But in order for luck to occur, you've got to relentlessly develop those abilities so they become natural to you. In other words, you've got to invest the time and energy in perfecting them. Find your strengths, develop those strengths, and luck will follow. And once again, I want to say thanks to Tom Corley for putting some of these words in my mind as we had a chat, and they're the sort of information that you're going to find in our regular Rich Habits, Poor Habits blogs on Property Update, and in my book together with Tom, Rich Habits, Poor Habits, where we train you to start developing more of the habits of the wealthy, successful people and ditch some of your poor habits. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?